Yeah, we're here.
Okay, alright then. So I'm assuming everyone is all ready. Let's welcome PM to OpenGov's case. Here.
Hi everyone, name's Jen, pronounce she, her. Think I'll accept yours, maybe at the fifth. So with all of that, let me set my timer real quick. Okay, set my timer. Before I start, I'd like to first clarify if I'm quite audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. I'll be starting. I'll be starting in three, two, one. When the previous administration fails you and the society has a distrust towards its government that is politically oppressive in ideals before, we say that these states needs the most is the right to challenge what medias and propagandas they have been fed. Few points of discussion then. When we say that these states are transitioning to a new democracy, meaning to say that these states previously come from authoritarian administrative, if not authoritarian, maybe politically ideally oppressive. Talking about how laws are often imposing due to, for example, towards what is favorably in that society. But B, let's talk about how often they came from fresh wounds and civil war due to the internal disputes between the ideology and dispute internally to what is societally, for example, like acceptable in their society. But C, let's talk about how political ideals from this state can be coercive and conservative that often, for example, hinders the progressive change that they actually want. But D, there's inherent distrust towards the government, considering that there's already a new transition towards a new type of administration, right? Means to say that there's also like previously medias that are heavily under censorship, primarily because of like certain ideas that are, for example, controversial for them or not societally accepted. Means to say that these transitional periods are undergoing state rebuilding, and there's still inherent distrust between the people towards its incumbent, for example, government. Means to say that if there's a transitional period, there's a focus in rebuilding and state building. And I'm talking about how these, for example, states can be, for example, progressively better for its people. Means to say that I want to say that there's an incapacity of the state to provide and disseminate information that are actually, for example, accurate and objective enough for all of its people, considering that they came from a certain type of administration, right? So here's where we tell you on our first argument that number one, informal journalism allows the people to exercise their democratic rights towards their incumbent government that were not previously given from them. When we talk about informal journalism, it looks like these type of journalism look like citizen journalism, or it provides the community's problems from the ground, often came from the people on the ground, the grassroots. Because it means to say that these journalism arise due to criticizing, for example, the state that they have previously, for example, the incapacity of the state to give them, for example, what are seen, for example, as something that is going to be helpful from them. Means to say that B, it comes from grassroots problems and systemic issues. And this informal journalism is entirely emotionally driven. Means to say that this comes from, for example, the emotional appeal or how they're, for example, being treated by the previous administration. Why is it important in the long run, and how do we support this? We say that on the justification first, the previous administration only allows limited perceptions of views, i.e. talk about how progressive ideals are often censored because it may or may not be actually favor, for example, the administration or like political agenda that they have. Means to say that it talks about how abortion may be seen as controversial topic, sorry, trigger warning, and it means to say the justification of how this informal journalism should, for example, accrue is on number one, it's a reparation of the lack of platforms that were given to them back then, since they did not have any like new democracy back then. Means to say that this is the transitionary period, means to say that best time to bite, for example, and give, for example, the freedom of speech to be able to say what, for example, are like the communities or what is the communities facing, for example. Is to say that these, for
PY.
example, like this, for example, level of benevolence from this informal journalism allows, for example, for intersectionality, for example, in terms of making change and better, for example, to transition and a new, for example, profound state. Means to say that true, true objectivity, for example, is still a level of discussion at this point. We say that the objectivity that comes from our house, even if, for example, there might arise, for example, of untrue journalism, the extent of preference, for example, or convergence towards reliable network or institution, for example, is already like checks and balances that cross out, for example, these untrue, for example, journalists, if Off wants to posit that. Means to say that I want to say that there's already an inherent gravitation towards people towards legitimized institutions or journalists. Means to say that even if, for example, this informal like journalism arise, it does not necessarily overshadow or
POI.
overcast, for example, the journalist, because there's an active call-out mechanism that still can exist on both house. Why is what we want to tell you is on the support runs on extensive longevity and better for the, for example, established state. Because when we say that number one, progressive change in a time of transitionary period, it's better to have, for example, intersectionality of the perception, primarily coming from informal journalism, because it allows diversity to be between experience and between factions, for example, to speak for what they truly need. Means to say that these types of journalism allow to sway and appeal to the emotions of the people to be able to have a cause like mobilization of the people that hey, this is something that we need as a faction, and we have to, for example,
POI.
cater to us. This is far more better because it's important for a state that is in transitionary period to adopt democracy, to start, for example, exercising the rights that they inherently have. But if, for example, opposition tries to posit that if it is in a transitionary period and it's volatile, what so yada yada, we tell you that pacifying, for example, the people will only lead to complacency and not for you only push, for example, these people to be complacent on their issues. You only push for these people to not speak up because you have to achieve stability, for example. This is very problematic because this is will be what will be adapting, for example, for a new established change. But for example, for a state that needs to be, for example, like that needs to be catered to towards its people to adopt, for example, democracy. It should start with the right, for example, of every people to have the freedom of speech, and this also includes informal journalism. The principal justification is that they did not have any platform from before. Let's go towards second, for example, worst case scenario that we have. Let's go towards polarization. We'd say that even towards, for example, the traits of polarizing, for example, the society, I'd say that this polarization is better for you to have a level of discussion and level of benevolence to how, for example, we're going to accept ideals on how we have an intersectionality that caters to majority of the people, considering that number one justification that I already told you is that these, for example, states came from previously, for example, administration that failed them to do so, that have long been, for example, internally oppressive. Say that what I want, for example, the future or these states to have is when, for example, abortion in informal journalism is not seen as controversial or not censored by the media. But second, the capacity of institutionalized journalism is something that we do recognize, but the informal like journalism is what thing we want to support for its people to realize that your freedom of speech can still be recognized. With all of those reasons,
Thank you for that speech. To open the case coming from up, let's welcome LO. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, but hold on. I think PM is still unmuted. PM?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Okay. Go ahead, LO.
Okay, thanks. Can I open my camera? I'm having to opening my camera. Hi, I'm Adi. Pronouns are he, him. POI preference through voice. But before, can I ask for permission if I can record my speech?
Is Gov okay with that?
Yeah, very
TPM
good.
Okay, on the next word. There's just so many reasons why informal journalism cannot work under transitional periods of new democracies. But first, let's dismantle some of the things that have come from Prime Minister. So I'll first going on with dismantling, and then we'll go over to reframing, cleaning up things in this debate, and then going to our arguments. Now, first, they tell us the transition means that they are in the process of state building, that they would want to have accurate information. That's something that we actually are fine with. That's in fact correct. Informal democracies, informal journalism means that they try to protrude to us this argument that informal journalism would mean that they would be able to exercise the democratic rights. But do know that formal journalism is still an exercise of their democratic rights. And in the end, moreover, that the events that caused the democracy, like they're trying to prove to us that having informal journalism would mean that you would not have political brainwashing anymore, as opposed to, for example, the prior administration, or before, like the new democracy transition. But we tell you that the proof that it does not anymore exist is the transition, because you've been able to, for example, topple or remove a dictator. That means that you already have proof that you have already been able to dismantle political brainwashing. They also tell us that diversity is something so important in the transitional period of new democracies. But we tell you this: you don't need confusion and diversity at a time where social cohesion is the utmost priority. And you don't just, you just can't trade off polarization. In fact, there has already been a decision. You've already been able to cater to the
Jellyn.
majority. So, and that only means that you've been able to already, you're already in a point in which you are now, you now need social cohesion. But before I go on to actually even just start my framing, yes, POI.
Even if you remove the dictator, their fanatics do not disappear.
But then again, there's so much discussion already happening in the country. Let's now go on to our framing so that you're more clarified on this matter. So in this matter, informal journalism would look like, again, vloggers, ordinary people being able to like cover social issues. Those are like social issues, but like again, we tell you they're not as competent, because as opposed to formal journalism, where they're established and credible media organizations, they have their own code of ethics. They are established. They have aligned with they have a level of legitimacy. They're in line with, for example, they're aligned with a lot of media organizations. They basically have the pool of a network of competent people to report and to have factual information. They're well informed. They are more nuanced. They're less speculative. They do not always engage on opinions, but they're more on facts. They're able to give already like a sense of clarity to the people, because again, these are not only, we already tell you, these are not state controlled. These are also people, and so we already take down the argument that they would not have a better democracy in our world. We also tell you then that for how does transitional periods of democracy of new democracies look like? These looks like South Korea coming out from an authoritarian rule, the Philippines coming out from an authoritarian rule, becoming a democratic country, post-war, post-coup d'etat, post-military junta, where there's unstable, there's instability. You're just in the process of trying to rebuild back your institutions, and where you need stability, because in transition period there are weak institutions. They just came from war or social unrest. You need social cohesion, because from that point, the reason why you were able to come from a point of, for example, authoritarian rule and then a transition period to new democracy was because there was so much discussion, and that prompted for the people to move. And so after that, you don't need to like continue discussing and move again to like remove a leader. That's what happened during Cory Aquino's time, when they were able to oust Marcos, and then there was just so many things happening, so many discussions, and not even like a year in office, he was already being tried to be ousted. How will that affect our institutions? How will that affect our economy? How will that affect the ordinary Filipino people just trying to feed their family, like put food on the table? And so what we tell is this: people are looking for clarity. They're not looking for more chaos. And so we start with our very first argument, wherein it has to happen now. Formal journalism has to happen now. Why is this true? Because media organizations, they're credible, they're factual, they are separated from the state, and they're actually recognized as the fourth estate. They're independent. They do not allow for their emotions or for their opinions to win over facts. They're more nuanced. They give you, okay, so this is what happens, this is what also happens. They tell you the analysis. They don't just brainwash you. They don't just give off their opinions to you. And more so, they also have the means to actually inform the people more, because they have the scope. Again, in terms of in terms of informal journalism, you usually need the phone. But note that for formal journalism, you can access it through phone, you can access it through paper, and these are during times of transitional periods, which means that everyone's probably like just in a period of like they're not really exactly rich to buy a phone or like be informed. And so having these formal journalism means that even in the far-flung areas, you'll be able to have these types of information. For example, what's happening in the country, what's the current priorities of the new government, of the new democracy, how do they care about us? Moreover, that means that there's much more legitimacy. There's also access to government. They're gonna be able to like, especially during these times where people have so many questions, like, okay, we now have a new democracy, but obviously we want clarity. So what will we get from them? What will the changes be from the authoritarian rule? And the formal journalists would be able to cater to this request of the people, especially even from far-flung areas, because they have already access to government. They have a network already of people that they can easily access. So what's happening? What's going to be your priorities? Moreover, why we tell you that it has to happen now, because they are the only type of journalism that's able to give them clarity, that's able to calm the people down, that chill, pipe down, things are going to be good, things are going to be better. Now I know we came from chaos, but these are the current strategies of government. They're able to lessen the polarization that will actually manifest in government's world. We also tell you that they're able to provide much more clarity and hope, because again, formal journalism, they're much more credible. They're a network of people. But then we tell you what's a negative case. A negative case that we have against government is simple: that the capacity of informal organization or formal journalism to actually journalize things is incompetent in terms of formal journalism. Why do we say this? Because they're usually based off of flawed opinions. They have the capacity to create echo chambers, because obviously formal journalism, these are media organizations trying to report the same thing, but they're trying to be so competent about it, and so they try to report the most accurate stuff. However, informal journalists have a tendency to just have clickbait, or like report the most controversial stuff, talk about the most famous things, or even just just try to get more engagement. And so we tell you that they're prone to making echo chambers. They're prone to like just lying to the people. They don't have they don't even follow a set of code of ethics. So in terms of like credibility and stability, you're able to protect the very principles of democracy and stability in our world. And for all of these reasons, proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. To continue the case coming from Gov, let's welcome DPM here.
Hi, please give me a few seconds. Okay, hi. Wait, I'm not sure if I should open cam. Hali, should I? I'm really scared. Wait lang, I have less pages this time with your base. Ay, not less, pero at least back to back. And still, the electric fan is directed to me, but I think that's fine. Yeah, same as the previous round. I'll just just raise your hand consistently. Don't worry, I will be calling you guys to raise POI. Ika lang. First team in chat. Okay. Okay. I'll start with the next word. During the snap election that happened in the Philippines, the media lost credibility because the social division push that Cory's victory was flagged by biased corporations. If you believe government's case, that the opposition's case, that the vast majority already has aligned incentives or principles, then all of the harms they mention about informal journalism, such as creating tension and info congestion, are simply impossible to accrue. This means that social cohesion is not a problem if you believe LO's framing, but I think it's much more far-fetched to believe that the aims of informal journalism is there only to push for putting away a person in power, but also because opposition literally opposes the premise of democratic actions like protesting when that's your very goal at the end of the day. But also to clarify, this is not an either-or motion because you're not replacing anything. It's on coexistence. I'll nuance this later. This is precisely why informal journalism should enter immediately, because this proves how the testimonies from the media indeed are accurate or inaccurate from what people say when history is still fresh, when the event is still relevant. But also because even if informal journalists oppose the news of these institutional journalists, the margin is emphasis on the accuracy for correction. I think that on-site government, since it happens immediately, you resolve the tension during times when the event is still fresh from the memories of the people. Likely, this means more active incentives for discussion that raises the concern to the people who are currently experiencing those conditions. These are the very things that is part of the transition period. These are not things that are outcasted from the transitionary period. On-site opposition, when informal journalism is suppressed, two things likely would happen. One, it is much more plausible for these people to resort to more punitive actions, such as borrowing the rhetoric of rallying even with a false cause. But this also means that it's less likely for them to still believe that the current government is now much more legitimate because you prevented them from talking to begin with, or the likely counterfactual that they have to bite, that these oppressed emotions likely would resurface on the future timeline. They cannot best neutralize this and say that it also happens on our end. But the safety net on-site government is the fact that you have more retrospect information and more information sources that can directly outweigh reinterpretations, such as historical revisionism and any other methods that's currently happening in status quo. On opposition, it's harder to correct this because the narrative is now controlled by the now majority population instead of the past majority population who viscerally felt these events much more accurately. By the end of this response, two things. One, the importance of informal journalism is necessary to push better credibility of information regardless of the trust and distrust of the people within the system that currently exists. But two, that even with instability, at least people get the immediate effect that all of their voices are not being silenced, in contrast to the previous regime that ruled at the end of the day. New democracies is precisely the period when tension is very high, where institutions like enforcing bodies and the press have low credibility, so you cannot simply say that on-site opposition, the likely counterfactual is simply clarity. The importance is not on immediate solvency through rebuilding, because your capacity is extremely low on both ends, but on gathering the amount of perceptions and incentives of the people you have to prevent the recurrence of that democratic backsliding, because previous regimes never cared about these individuals, but also because the people who opt into informal journalism during these transitional periods are likely brave individuals who would be open to calling out, protesting on streets or what have you. So at best, their form of solvency literally still falls on them, but probably in the latter timeline. This is where PM's material is important and positioned further. Will bite this. Probably this is going to be much more chaotic if you believe side opposition, which we think is extremely fine. Because one, on technicalities, the chaos simply exists on both ends. But rather on opposition, it's much more scattered on timeline, but also because the accuracy diminishes over time. But two, the immediate chaos is necessary because your main incentive isn't only to ensure the success of the transition, but also that the endpoint of that new democracy is massively different from the previous form of government that like retrospectively exists in that country. But three, because even if there's chaos in the messaging that happens, or probably at worst there exists like information congestion or what have you, you give them an outlet to release their grievances that likely are heightened already due to the transition. So it means that there's less necessity for people to continuously bring instability on the table, because at least they have legitimate measures for expression instead of isolated approach that happens on-site opposition. So if Prime Minister bites that there would be immediate division, it is much more corrective on our end over the end on-site opposition. Before going further, point.
Discussion about dismantling political brainwashing is symmetrical even without informal journalism. The event that caused for the new democracy to rise was already a proof of this, e.g. ousting a dictator. That can't happen if you're still deep in political brainwashing.
So I think that is extremely important because that only neutralizes the very argumentation coming from LO, which is their only tipping point, but also because the discussion coming from DPM literally tells you that even if it's not guaranteed to literally oust these individuals, or the fact that these people would be focused towards the information itself, it is fine because we've already proven that the main incentive is not only on successfully transitioning, but ensuring that that form of transition would lead towards better outcomes instead of like simply just having a new government. Let's further the margin and discuss it based on the unique element that this brings to the table. One, the casual language that Gov exclusively has is what allows for the active reclamation of their new democratic state. This is massively relevant, especially for those states that are recently colonized by other countries, which is already framed by PM, because preventing them to publicly engage literally reinforces narratives, e.g. colonial mindsets, such as like the English language literally is much more better than your own Filipino language, or the fact that even locally Tagalog became a much more superior form of consideration in legal processes or what have you, forgetting other languages such as Cebuano, Chavacano, etc. But secondly, study disengages that even if the amount of informal journalism directly outweighs the amount of information dissemination from these formal journalists, I say that's fine because most systems that rise immediately after liberation during the early times of the transitional periods are heavily reminiscent of previous structures, and I'll impact this further later. But intuitively, this looks like this borrowing the same rhetoric and focus that your previous system provided, e.g. the reliance of the rise of journalism only to private companies like ABS-CBN or GMA. But also this means that you enable a much more elitist narrative that the basis of information should come from these institutions instead of the common people. What this tells you is two things on incentives is simple. One, this lessens the incentive for people to try to reach things more based on what they see on surface level. They immediately believe certain surface level information on opposition. But two, because it means that institutions are more adaptive of the people on the ground instead of actively catering to the people on the top. Albeit the very worst case that the transition falls. One, this might sound intuitively a harm, but no, it's not, because new democracies being much more exploratory in nature means that the very state ruling directly opposes to the majority incentive of the people currently living. But on extents, this does not mean that the people would no longer push for alternative individuals to rule as well. So even if you believe that they are there to put the current administration away, it's fine, because at least people's opinions are more centered on exercising their democratic rights instead of thinking that it ends immediately after replacing the previous bad actor. Note, replacing a bad actor does not mean that the replacement is immediately a good actor. But also because I don't understand why we shouldn't push for optimization if we really want the success of this form of implementation. I think it's quite clear coming from opposition that they want that your end goal is not simply to transition to a new state, but towards a better form of democracy. You only get that on-site government. All those reasons propose.
Thank you for that speech. To continue the case coming from up, let's welcome DLO. Here.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, POS to voice, thank you. Panel, in a young state without proper institutions, with extensive instability, we would not support the likes of Alex Jones, of Ben Shapiro, of TikTok stars shaping the minds of the nation. We think that for government to support this is simply silly, and we tell you that that's not the case. I want to reframe some things regarding all of the actors within this debate, and I'm going to take down the entirety of Stewie's case. Firstly, is on these new democracies and in the transition period. We know that first and foremost that this is unstable, and we cannot stress this enough about the instability that they likely went through a post-war or civil war or a coup that led to a lot of things still going on, that they're likely still fanatics, as Stewie points out, within the country, and that it is important for them to consolidate them. The second thing I want to point out is that they're poor. The majority of the people probably don't have phones or the necessary tools to be able to get all of the informal journalism from that side government pauses. So we tell that a lot of their benefits aren't true. But then lastly, is that they are likely already trusted and needs trust to continue. So you cannot buy government's arguments that say that, oh, the people don't like the new democracy because they think that they're untrustworthy. Because we tell you that for the new democracy to occur, that they needed the trust of the people. Think the people power revolution, where they needed the people to go and help them establish themselves. And we tell you that it is in their incentive to continue that trust. They can continue staying in power, and that is why the media organizations are better on our side. Second thing I want to frame is on the informal journalism. Adi already told you that is with vloggers and social media personalities. We tell that this is bad for two reasons. Firstly, that they tend to be for three reasons. Firstly, that they tend to be radical, that they tend to be very uninformed. But then secondly, is that they tend to be very the communities that arise because of tend to be echo chambers, that people are only listening to themselves and aren't listening to the other viewpoints. And lastly is that the incentives are wrong, because the incentives for vloggers and social media personalities is to get attention. The way that they get attention is by radicalizing and putting out extreme narratives. And we do not think that that is a good thing because of the reasons that I'll explain to you later. The third thing I want to reframe is the power of the journalism, because we tell you that it is important because it changes the influence system minded every person within the country. And lastly is on formal journalism. We tell you that it is they are from trusted media organizations, that they likely are already established from the past, so people trust them. And lastly, that they are not only controlled by the government, that there are different private entities that have different spectrums. So do not buy their claim that, oh, it's only going to be one point of view. We tell that there's going to be numerous points of views. We tell the panel that within this debate, that there are two metrics that both teams need to achieve to win. Firstly, stability, and most importantly, stability. We tell you that it is without stability that you get an unsafe nation, that this nation falls apart. But the secondly is democratic discourse, and and opposite, we tell you the government tries to make you pick one, but we tell you that it's only side opposition that you get both. First, on some extraneous rebuttals. Firstly, on this point that they get more democratic discourse, we tell you, panel, that democracy is dead if the ideas that people get are misguided. That Adi already proved to you that the structural drawbacks of the informal journalism, that the people are single individuals compared to organizations, which means that they have likely less expertise, they have less research power, and they're unable to get the primary sources from everything. The second thing is that not everyone has phones or internet to achieve all of this. We tell you that a majority of people within these war-torn nations likely still rely on newspapers. But then and then I'll get to outweighing this point later. The next thing I want to rebut is Stewie's POI to Adi on how there's fanatics within the government. We think that this is very silly because fanatics of the old administration on their side of the house would simply become informal journalists and grow a large amount of followers from the former supporters. We tell that it's on our comparative that these fanatics are unlikely to get as much power and reestablish themselves. Next two things I want to take down. They tell you that on their side that informal just allows people to talk more because of important issues. But we tell you that this is symmetrical. On either side, people will be discussing the issues that they have to deal with in this new democracy because this is important. And we tell you that we tell you that they still are able to do so on either side of the house. The second thing is that they want to tell you that freedom of expression is more important than stability. I feel like they're strongly underestimating the importance of stability in a post-war nation. Because in a post-war nation, when you are poor, when you're hungry, you don't care about whether your voice is heard. You care about not having another war. We tell you that on their side of the house, worst case scenario, that the instability leads to more polarization, leads to a development of more and more conflict. What are path to victories? We tell you that's solely coming from opposition, that you get less instability, that people, and that we tell you that we are able to get democratic discourse as a result of formal journalism. Firstly, I want to rebuild on Adi's case how
POI.
formal journalism is needed now. Before that, POI.
This is still the transitionary period, by the way, but are they really that unified when it's transitioning? If they are, then what form of instability does informal journalism bring when it carries the same voices of the people on the ground?
I think the issue that Adi already proved to all of you that on informal journalism is that there's a lot of different voices coming out. That there's people from all over the spectrum, and that they tend to be very radical. At the very least, with formal journalism, they tend to be at the very nuanced, not as radical, and they tend to they're not as like that their incentives is to inform rather than radicalize and get attention. Firstly, on rebuilding, what Adi told you two things. Firstly, that informal journalism and this current society is very polarized. That after the post-war state, there's likely going to be different groups, and what we need now is stability, is a unified voice. And the second is that people need hope. That in the post-war nation, that you need hope. What will I do? I'll bring to you like the unique things about why formalization is good. Firstly, is how they are more well informed. We tell you this is true for three reasons. Firstly, that they have checks and balances because of the fact that instead of one TikTok star training out information, it's a whole organization and there's a whole like journalistic process. The second thing is that you have experts, and that you have people who are like well researched and experts on these topics. And lastly, is that they have a direct line to the government and primary sources, which leads to them having greater capacity for better information. The second thing that is important about formal journalism is that they are nuanced, and the third thing is that they are accessible because of the fact that they have other ways simply than just in social media, things like print media. The impacts of this are twofold. Firstly, is that we stabilize things. Why? Because people hear from hear from only a handful of unified voices from trustworthy sources that are not as radical. But then secondly is that we tell that people are more cognizant of the happenings, that because of because of the accessibility and because of the proper info, that we more democracy, which wins on their only metric. What are the weighing metrics for this? We tell that firstly we win this because of vulnerability, because the most vulnerable people are likely the ones affected by polarization. Secondly, on accessibility, that people who don't have phones are able to listen to that. And thirdly, on scale, in that on their comparative, you cannot access benefits like talking to the government to get proper information. Last thing I want to add before my time is up is that informal journalism tends to be very biased, that tend to be only single person, and that they also tend to be paid actors by external by other external forces. And we tell you that their incentives are wrong. Because of this, they exacerbate instability. Proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. To continue the case coming from Goff, let's welcome Goff. We're here.
Hello. Alright, visible. I don't know
Yes.
how my hair looks, but anyways, the hell with that. Can you pass me the things? Let me just like set up some things. This is gonna be a bad angle, but anyways. POS preferably if sorry. POS preferably just raise your hand. If not, you don't need to verbalize it because I'll try to engage with everything possible. Pronounce anything. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Proximity and accessibility to information and awareness comes first for the people, and when in times of like transitioning regimes from a previously authoritative one to a sprouting democracy, because something like visibility is something that works best because you deter malicious actors, e.g. progressive authoritarians, for example, to take over and actively try to to actively pressure them to focus on citizens first before economic growth that harms a lot of minority groups. This intro clarifies, therefore, that what the goal of side government is very simple and clear: that you shine light to the lived realities of these people and actively deter public outrage and confusion insofar as you get your voice heard and expressed, as opposed to like being like oppressed, for example, and censored. You release the tension and often results to catharsis, and it's something that's far more productive when it comes to like the discussions that you have on the ground. The way I'm gonna go with this government speech is immediately weigh the issues. The first is just generally where journalism is far better off within these transitionary like governments or new democracies, because opposition says that there's a lot of like misinformation and like there's a lot of like polarization, brainwashing, and confusion and what have you. But we explained why things work for our side. First, what we explained from Niles was clear: that oftentimes these transitioning democracies are inherently volatile. This means that there exists a lot of different political groups and actors and or even socioeconomic groups that aims to replace the previous authoritative regime, right? This means that although there are existing differences between these groups, there exists a unified or an intersectionality within the interests that they have, which is to seek for reparation. What we explain is that the role of informal journalism here is simple: that it paints the lived realities of these societies. Think citizen journalism, for example, where they paint their struggles socioeconomically in terms of like healthcare, education, and job opportunities, or even extends towards social issues, e.g. on gender rights and what have you, as clearly explained by Niels when she talked about like abortion and like the stigma around abortion and what have you, for example. This is something that's crucial because the way the messaging goes is it's something that's justifying their clamor for change and the access of platforms, as what Niels explains clearly down to Stewie when we explain that the transition from the previous regime, for example, was something that inherently denies them from these rights in the get-go. This being at the transitionary period is something that's crucial because we understand that the process of overthrowing the previous regime resulted from a leading political group, for example, that transitioned into the incumbent government or administration. This is me engaging with our worst case. We understand that, and this is me again engaging with the worst case, that more groups will tend to push their political reparations as far more quote unquote important and ought to be prioritized, and that they ought to lead because they were the most oppressed group, for example. This is a polarization case that we get from opposition, the competing narratives that opposition argues. What we explain is that currently the intersectionality is now centralized on one goal, which is something that looks like better national building for nation building, for example, and a more coherent and sustainable one, for example, precisely because these separate factions have the same entity that oppressed them in the previous regime. They now are able to function under relatability and proximity, for example. They more so function under the banner of like empathy with each other because they now know what it's like to be oppressed by a previous regime, for example. That means that there is a clear unifying metric to find a common ground, to be patient, for example, because they now understand that more than ever that the system is incredibly volatile, that they ought to receive the reparations in due time. But moreover, this form of proximity and relatability is what bolsters the outreach and polarization that LO calls us out for, precisely because they get to engage with mass discussions and online forums that offers multiple perspectives. They get to leave their grievances aside and become more rationalized individuals, preventing mass hysteria precisely because you lessen the outrage in the get-go. Talk about the copium that happens that they go through. You're far better going to secure stability within in terms of like the society as far as you get to have them express themselves and you have this sort of this coping like social circles that gets to validate their emotions, for example. This is a direct flip from DLO extension on echo chambers, because oftentimes echo chambers are only able or enabled when they do not get exposed to altering or perspectives or rather opposing narratives. For example, they do not correct the values and narratives that propagate within these echo chambers on their side. It's far worse because you box them out. You completely let them off of like these sort of like discussions in the get-go. You completely isolate them. You don't directly let them engage within these sorts of like discussions. You leave them reliant to formal journalists that still functions under like biases and what was explained from Stewie, for example. Moreover, this is why Niles is incredibly important. When she explained to you that you get to have far more likely to mobilize the people, this is something that's extremely important because social mobilization is a prerequisite to have like a liberal sort of like and functioning democracy in the long run, for example, that often regulates the perverse political actors in like the longevity, for example. This is precisely the reason why the transition period is unlikely to fail, because you give an avenue and platform for people to feel more empowered, which they did not have in the previous regime, which is something that that's more likely going to extend towards the counterfactual that's existing within opposition. This is something that's extremely important in debate winning because it determines the level of which you get to regulate these democracies to be functioning at the very end of the day. On side opposition, what's more likely to happen is rallying, as what Stewie explains, because these formal journals are biased in the get-go, because they're oftentimes directly engaged with political actors in the previous regime, for example. But even if that's not immediate, what we explain is that these media outlets that are owned by perverse political actors that they receive, where they receive like immediate backing, for example, and resource financing, what have you, they're likely to cause more polarization, and no active call-outs to check and balance these things could happen more and more, and it just cascades to a overly much more polarizing and much more confusing state. For example, you don't have regulation to happen precisely because people will do not actively engage with these narratives. For example, talk about the misinterpretations and what have you. At the end of this, if you weigh this out on scale of gravity and a scale on gravity, you're more likely going to have better regulated narratives and get to prevent outrage, which is the symmetric harm on both sides. On side opposition is just far worse for you. Next is just generally on where on extents you get better nation building, for example. The next thing they explain at DLO is that their people are incapacitated right now because they don't have phones and they don't have the capacity to research. Yada yada. This kills their case if they agree that there are existing formal journalists or institutions that exist and brainwash people like they conceded from Stewie, and the citizens no longer are able to cross-examine whether these forms of news are something that's true or polarizing. For example, just to prove the harms further on side opposition, they're far more likely going to tolerate informed echo chambers. But second, this is just uncomparative at best because we were already able to explain that the form of messaging is something that looks like citizen journalism. It's not about how to grow your bank revenues, for example, is what DLO explains, or like how to these sort of like media influencers, but more on sharing the nuances and the pressure that they experienced within their previous sort of regime. At the end of this, like you cannot weigh this out on longevity if you do not get the people engaged within these narratives that gets to propagate within status quo. All those reasons, clearly, government.
Thank you for that speech. To continue the case coming from Up, let's welcome Up Web here.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes.
All right. Just give me a second. I'll just skip my timer. Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. It is quite clear that in a time of chaos and a time of utter disinformation propagated by the people that feel as if though they have no control over what is happening, what you need is a formalized avenue to ensure that these people have hope for the future, certainty that things will get better, and you only get that on the opposition comparative. The first thing that I want to do is just give technical calls to the case that you get coming from side proposition. Firstly, on the timeline, Prop explains that at first, you gain diversity with perspective. But the response to this is really simple. They don't explain why this matters. But also, at the point in time in which you oust a dictator, you've already catered to the majority. The implication of this is that naturally the benefits of diversity and about talking about these things don't really matter, because on a technicality of the motion, just because it's in the transitional process does not mean you haven't ousted the dictator yet, because particularly the argumentation that you use on your comparative also act like you've ousted the dictator. That means to say that under our comparative, the job is done, people feel as if the victory has been secured. What is most important now is to ensure that things get better in the process, which is exactly why you need these formal systems in the first place. But secondly, just technical call out, they don't explain why informal journalism is a complete net benefit and likely to manifest well under their comparative. I think that their side is still susceptible to a lot of the attacks that we explained. That these things are still prone to political polarization. That is exactly when it does become accessible. That the cronies that they want to talk about, or the fanatics that Stewie wants to POI, will actually have the accessibility and the capacity to make sure that these political scenes are muddled. So I think that in terms of fanatics and making sure that radicalization happens, it's far worse under their comparative. When these people do not have to go through formalized avenues to ensure that information is propagated, I think that is when it becomes far more messy on their side. But naturally, I also want to integrate the analysis that you get from side opposition within this response. It is the fact that both Adi and Morgan explain that when it is informal journalism, you likely have to compete with other informal journalists in order to hear that you are heard. Yeah, in order to make sure that you are heard. And therefore, the implication of this is that there is a level of competition. And I would note, this is worse, because that's when you have to compete for headlines. You have to compete for things to get far more radical in order to ensure that people opt into you. And also, this manifests in things like elitism, like Stewie wants to talk about, primarily because if it is only the case in which you have a phone, and that is the only instance in which you are able to propagate informal journalism, which their whip concedes to, and they don't even try to respond to, then clearly it means that the people who have phones, the people who have some level of elitism, likely are the ones that are propagating this narrative of informal journalism instead. On our comparative, we explain that you have things like papers, so it ensures that the most vulnerable of people who don't have access to phones or technology still are kept in the loop. And this is important because those are the people who oftentimes need hope the most. They're the people who need certainty as to how their future will unfold. Under their comparative, all of these things are lost. Don't believe in them when they explain that things will likely be done well. It's likely going to be extremely messy moving forward for the rest of the state, which is exactly why formal journalism needs to happen now. The first issue that I want to discuss is on people. What does proposition explain in this regard? They explain that you have legitimate discussion and you reclaim the narrative for your people. And the method that they give here is that you reparate for the fact that you had no ability to access them democratic information beforehand. Why does this not work? A, these discussions would have likely happened regardless. I don't see how this is an exclusive benefit on your comparative. The ousting of democracy and the formation of the ousting of a dictator and the formation of a new democracy is likely something that is increasingly talked about due to the very political nature of it. So that means that these discussions are quite moot because on our comparative, at the very least, you filter out the bad discussions or the unproductive discussions. Because importantly, these things would have happened regardless, as I already explained. But B, their case line promotes competition and making the craziest headlines and radicalization, which is what I explained earlier. But I want to note specifically why this is true. Firstly, is that you don't get paid for informal journalism. Therefore, you earn based on likes, clicks, and shares. But secondly, conversely on our comparative, formal journalist agencies pay you wages. They don't just hire anyone. The implication of this is that people are more informed under our comparative. Then you have less cognitive dissonance. C is that when with informal journalism, you cannot call out radicalization and bad things. And notably, because they aren't able to sufficiently respond to this and they implicitly concede that their benefit is accessibility, which is technically the prerequisite to radicalization, and they don't really respond to it, the problem is that people will not be able to call this out. Why? It is exactly for the reasons that they give you on-side proposition, that you think you are reclaiming your narrative, that you think this is a victory over the dictators. Problem is that since we already proved that these discussions are likely to be unproductive, you cannot call these things out because you view it as your own victory. Now, how do we solve this on our comparative? We explain that these discussions, firstly, will likely be formalized. You will likely be getting a pool of people that knows how to source information, that knows the accurate credentials, that won't just give you a random disinformation. And secondly, it's the fact that these are large news agencies. I'm pretty sure that if a large news agency is talking about something, we can call them out because a lot of the spotlight will be on them. So in terms of actually correcting this information in the now and in the long term, we're able to do this better because there's active accountability mechanisms for the people. This means that not only do we get the benefits of it happening now, which is important because we literally explain the urgency of people being misinformed, but we explain that it's going to be far better in the future. The implication of this first issue is that on terms of people, they are far better on our comparative in terms of how they actually access this information and how they discuss with other people about it. But secondly, I want to just talk about on journalism and the capacity to actually gather this information in the first place. Firstly, we explain quite importantly that it needs to be formalized now because it's a very uncertain period.
Why?
And the unique benefit, go.
Everything from Gov assumes that the interest, from Op assumes that the interest of the people never change and this is static.
Yeah, because your primary interest is to get rid of the dictator. That's something that doesn't change. Okay, so we explain on the issue of journalism that it needs to happen now because these people are very, very uncertain. Importantly, the unique benefit that is unable to be co-opted from their side and that we have on our comparative is specifically that you have a greater capacity to gain information. You have more people on net. You work as a collective, not as an individual. So naturally, you get a few benefits. Firstly, is that you're able to contact governments far better insofar as that you're able to seem legitimate to this new democracy, which inherently means that you're able to cover things insider information about the processes of this new democracy, the processes of who gets appointed to certain things. Whereas if you are an individual journalist, you have individual informal journalist, you likely have much less of a capacity to do these things in the first place. But B, it's the fact that you're able to lobby for things far better under our comparative. It is only when these things are formalized and actually legitimate that you can get the reforms. So even if you want to bite into their characterization where this newly elected leader is actually not good, by the way, we never needed to prove why they were good. We just needed to prove why they were democratic. At least under our comparative, we were able to formalize and forward these discussions far better in the sense that you were able to make these people listen. They will not listen when it's just some random TikTokers on live stream. They will listen if it's a formalized news agency backed up by the social movements that probably also have these same ideas and criticisms of the new government. Therefore, we win on three very simple weighing metrics. Firstly, on vulnerability, the most unaware people on their comparative are likely to be affected by political polarization. On our side, we protect them by allowing them to opt into what is most legitimate and quality. But secondly, on accessibility, you leave some people in the dark because they don't have a phone or a device because they're poor. On our side, you have paper, so they're more informed. Thirdly, on scale, on their comparative, you cannot access benefits like asking the government about democracy and things like that. We get on our side. I think it's pretty clear. Side opposite.
Thank you for that speech. To conclude the entire case, let's welcome Op reply. Here.
I think this entire debate has gone into the main question of which side gets a better society. And under this, there are two main subclashes. Firstly, on where is democratic discussions stronger? What does government tell you? Government tells you two main things. Firstly, is that there are more voices, which means that people get to assuming as like according to what they say, that people get to voice their opinion more. And secondly, is that their voices are stronger and that they get listened more to these people. Three layers of responses coming from us that we take it down. Firstly, is that this is simply not true, given that not everyone has phones or has access to the internet. In accordance to this, that they straight up concede the fact that majority of these informal journalists are people on the internet or social media rock stars, and we tell you that not everyone has access to them. And secondly, we tell you that they are uninformed at best, disinformed at worst. That is to say that on their best case these social media stars do not understand the extent that of these issues that they're trying to achieve, and that leads to a misunderstanding spreading towards the entire society, or at worst that they are paid actors, that they get support from like the radical fanatics that Stewie tries to posit in society, that they get paid, that it is so easy for people for bad actors to simply pay these social media stars and influencers to speak out these false information. We tell you that that is what happens on side government. But lastly is on radicalization and echo chambers. We tell you that because of the nature of social media, they are competing for headlines, they are competing for attention, that they tend to have more radical and stronger headlines, regardless of whether or not it's true, because again there are no checks and balances. What does this mean? That this means that people are less informed, people do not understand these to the proper extent, and we tell that that in and of itself falls in terms of whether or not it gets democratic discussions, because what is the point of democratic discussions if people don't understand? What do you get coming from side opposition on this issue? First, three things. First is that we tell you that people's voices are still heard because of the incentive for the government and the media corporations to listen. We tell you that the government has a lot of incentives to keep that the government used the people to get into power in the first place, and they have the incentive to keep on like appeasing to the people, because the people, so that they can get voted in as a democratic institution. And two, as government clearly says, that there are so many that these ideas are so strong that thus the media corporations have an incentive to get to like cater to these ideas and talk more about them and get that. We tell you that that their point that we get less representation for the people's voices is not true. But but that proves how we are symmetrical. Why are we better? We tell you that we are better for the simple reason that we are more informed, that we have checks and balances, that we have experts on our side through media corporations who understand the true meaning and the extent of which the issues are really are. We tell you that we are able to like get a more informed society, and having a more informed and understanding society is what getting democratic discussions is about. So that is the opposition for the first clash. The second clash is on which side gets strongest stability, because as we've said from the entire opposition bench, that stability is important given that this is a new democracy, likely from a post-war state, that they need safety and not to delve into another civil war. We tell you, coming from Adi already, that they already have that it is important that we do not get polarized even further. You get that solely from media corporations who have incentive to not like split the country even further. You don't get that on side government, where the people are incentivized to be radical and to polarize the people. Because of this, opposition win. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. To conclude Gov's case, let's welcome Gov reply. Here.
I'm very sorry. Stewie, could you check Messenger very quick? Sorry. Thank you.
Sige, Loditix. Okay, thanks. Nakita ko na. Give me 10 seconds. Okay, hi. Dala ako mag-open cam because pawis na ko. Narang. Wait lang. Forgot to rearrange my notes. Okay. Hindi na ako aesthetic. Let's go. Ayun, wala palang POIs for this time. Wala. Same lang pa rin pronouns. Okay. This is his supports versus opposes motion. Op never framed how the opposing happens. You only receive a clear comparative on our end. Only if this house believes that informal journalism is bad, motion can they have a motion in winning. But also on technicalities, we already traded off the mess you have. What we've proven is that that's likely going to be messy in the latter timeline during the immediate future on their own comparative, to which they never answer. The problem with opposition is that they're too myopic, thinking that the trust of the people is static and their demands remain the same. This is a weird clarification from opposition whip that you should never agree. But also because since you want a much more tangible legitimization on both ends, you should care about the long-term longevity. That's why the zero engagement about backsliding is precisely what poisons that all of their benefits only happens in the short run. It is less likely for them to have a properly democratic government on-side opposition. Check your notes. Opposition's reframing explicitly says that the incentives of the people are the same. If that is true, even if you diversify the sources of voices on-side government, it means that they also bring the same opinions and it does not majorly differ. But also because if people indeed do not listen to informal journalists, and by the way, they never contest how formal journalists do not exist on our end, then it means that the majority attention of the people still boils down towards these formal journalists instead of listening to your average TikToker. It means that all of their impacts are marginal at best, and the margin of clarity is untrue, and it's not a tipping point in this debate. Opposition kept rehashing about stability. Gov immediately contested this, that it's not a tipping point in the round because the transition is inherently unstable in nature on both ends, but also because the people living during that moment is already used and expected to living on instability. As early as PM, she already said that the people willingly accepted that instability because they know that stable governance with a misdirected democracy is just a form of covered up oppression. What they mainly demand, therefore, is a true form of tangible change at which you are able to see that these individuals are now able to speak contrary towards that previous oppressive regime, and ensuring that the person who replaces it is someone who bears the very same democratic narratives. Opposition says the replacement is guaranteed to be better than than the last. It doesn't mean that the people should no longer demand for more. So opposition, even if it's believed that your new leader is less worse, you can still demand for better leaders. What government did is by two things: that likely this is chaotic, and that likely the process of transitioning becomes longer on our end. What we prove, however, is that the true tangible reformation, such as replacing those retrospective systems like foreign narratives that likely already exist, can only happen if you continuously scrutinize them and you give them more amounts of time before you allow the new government to fully settle in. But two, that the long periods of time that you get on-site government give a necessarily sufficient timeline for other people's voices to be heard, such as Cebuano people, to which opposition previously prevented because of the massive irreconcilable speed you get on opposition. You only get those opinions on-site government. A president or government that allows them to speak intuitively already shows how more entertaining the state is right now. So if you want to emphasize how you truly are unifying, then you want to increase the volume of the people and tell the world that you are truly unifying through their voices, not only by these majority corporations. They talk about filtering bad discussions. This is the second and third that I want to discuss. One, this is weird. There aren't anything called bad discussions during times of transition because you are actively replacing the current elements of the state from what they are previously used to. But two, because they clearly do not listen about PM's discussion and DPM's extension still gravitates on the information that is not a form of pestering. If it's a form of squirreling and that is just those random TikTokers who do nothing except shout mean words, that is less likely for people to listen to them. But lastly, even if we're talking about call-out mechanisms, I don't necessarily understand why the people's voice suddenly becomes significant on-side opposition, primarily because they are already taught that we should always push for only internal methods only instead of resorting towards much more violent or much more democratic actions such as using their own voice. But two, because the retrospect system that they previously immersed themselves on literally is an active disincentive for them to engage on these discussions. But lastly, because we already bet that likely this will not be that maybe this will not be successful and that the state fails because of because of less opt-in. The form of destruction and instability is inherently a form of call-out mechanisms on government. You do not have to call out each actor individually. You only have to call out the actor at which the majority wants to posit is a bad actor and should be replaced. All of those reasons, government.
Thank you for that speech. That marks the end of the debate. Congratulations for both teams, virtually cross. And yeah, go back to the convening hall. As for the judges, can we go back to Discord and go to room 2 deliberations? Thank you so much.